This is a man who's opened his heart to the hearts of all of humanity. This is a man who cries with humanity, who laughs with humanity, who suffers with humanity. This is Pope Francis.
La humanidad vive una crisis. I'm convinced that we can make a difference. I'm sure. Pedimos perdón por los abusos sexuales por parte de miembros cualificados de la Iglesia.
We sat across from each other, and he said, Juan Carlos, the first thing I want to tell you is that I apologize for the pain that the church has caused you. I never thought I'd see that day.
Ser la voz, pero no de una manera programática, me sale solo. Y también por mi sangre migrante.
I was in the cells of the detention facility with children all around me. The border patrol that were watching us said, thank you, sister, for helping us see that they're human beings. To be a symbol of a presence of caring for humanity, to defend life, how our role can make a difference.
Yo quiero agradecer en su persona a todas las religiosas de los Estados Unidos. Las felicito. I think God made him experience what people experience.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Daniel Lavelle, the U.S. Director of Survival International, the global movement for tribal peoples. For over the last 50 years, Survival International has worked in partnership with Indigenous and tribal peoples all around the world to help them defend their lands, their livelihoods, and their lives against land theft and against violence. And it's my great pleasure to moderate today's panel discussion on the climate crisis as part of the impact campaign for the documentary Francesco, whose trailer we just saw at the beginning of this panel. The climate crisis is one of the world's most critical fights, and Indigenous and tribal peoples are clearly the central actors in that fight, not least because they're on the front lines of defending the most vulnerable and biodiverse areas on the planet from invasion and from destruction. 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is in Indigenous and in tribal territories. This is no coincidence. Indigenous peoples have sustainably managed these ecosystems for generations, and it's thanks to them that these areas are still vibrant. Protecting their rights to their lands is one of the best ways to protect the environment and to address climate change. Climate change is, of course, a global issue, and I'd like to introduce our panelists who will be discussing their work on the urgent climate crisis and actions that can be taken to address it. Kate Mackintosh is the inaugural executive director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at the UCLA School of Law. She's worked in the fields of human rights, international criminal justice, and the protection of civilians for over 2 decades. She led advocacy in support of some of the world's most vulnerable populations as head of humanitarian affairs for Doctors Without Borders, worked in post-conflict human rights field operations in Bosnia and Rwanda, and has held multiple roles at international criminal tribunals. She's deputy co-chair of the expert drafting panel on the legal definition of ecocide. Atossa Soltani is the founder and president of Amazon Watch, a nonprofit organization founded in 1996 to protect the rainforest and to advance the rights of Indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin. Currently, Atossa is the director of global strategy for the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative, working to protect one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth. The initiative is led by an alliance of Amazonian indigenous nations of Ecuador and Peru, with support from the Fundación Pachamama, Amazon Watch, and the Pachamama Alliance. Roberto Carlés is a lawyer with a specialty in criminal law and is the current president of the Laudato'Si Foundation. He's a member of numerous international organizations, including the Global Interfaith Commission on LGBT+ Lives, the International Academic Network for the Abolition of the Death Penalty, and the International Society of Social Defense and Humane Criminal Policy. Evgeny Afineevsky is the director of the film Francesco and an Oscar nominee for the documentary Winter on Fire, Ukraine's Fight for Freedom. His last film, Cries from Syria, received international acclaim and numerous awards. Welcome to y'all, and thanks for joining us today. I'd like to begin with a question for Kate. Kate, you're working with fellow human rights and environmental lawyers on the emerging legal concept of ecocide. You want to amend the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court to include ecocide as a crime alongside genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. What would it mean if ecocide were included in the Rome Statute, and what impacts do you think this would have?
Thank you so much, Daniel. Delighted to be part of this conversation. So if ecocide were included as part of the Rome Statute, that would mean that it would be, first of all, recognized as an international crime, which has some kind of important symbolic value, I think, because it means, and this is very much what we saw in the film, Pope Francis talking about, it means recognizing that the destruction of our ecology and our environment is as grave a threat as genocide or a crime against humanity. In fact, we might say that it is a crime against humanity. So I think there's an important symbolic or moral value to that. But practically what it would mean is that ecocide would be included in the Rome Statute system. And that means that countries that have signed up to the statute and are part of the International Criminal Court system would incorporate the crime into their domestic law. So every country, it's currently 122 countries, I believe, that are signed up, that are part of the system, would incorporate the crime of ecocide into their domestic law and would commit to investigating and prosecuting it. While, as you indicated, I'm involved in working on definition at the moment, so we haven't got the legal definition to share with you yet. There are a couple of things we do know about what this crime will look like because of the fact that it's embedded in the system, in the Rome Statute system. So the first thing is that this crime will have to be of a similar gravity to the current international crimes. So we're talking about acts, not any act of environmental destruction. We're talking about acts which can be seen to be of a gravity of the same level as genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes. So really serious environmental destruction. We're talking about criminal acts for which individuals will be found responsible. So we're not talking about state responsibility, and we're not talking about corporate liability. We're talking about individuals being held criminally responsible. And then we're talking about, in terms of where the law would be applicable, it would be applicable either in the territory of states which are part of the Rome Statute and have signed up to the International Criminal Court, or where the acts are committed by nationals of those states. So that's a bit the architecture that we're buying into if we get this crime onto the statute. In terms of the impact, well, I mentioned the moral or symbolic impact, but I think strategically, obviously what we're trying to do is change behavior, right? We're not particularly interested in throwing people in jail. It's about shifting the way we're living our lives and this kind of ecological disaster that we're heading towards. And our thinking is that the addition of an international crime might be one piece in the puzzle to shift behavior, because individuals responsible for massive environmental damage will for the first time be risking their own personal liberty. So you could imagine boards of directors of large industrial polluters, for example, when they're making their decisions about what to do, there'll be this new element that they'll have to take into account, this new factor in their risk analysis, which will be actually whether they might personally be held individually criminally responsible for their acts and be sent to jail, which we think could make quite a lot of difference in the way decisions are taken. And I think another hope is that specifically when thinking about corporate actions, the corporate sector is probably more susceptible to PR considerations than your average war criminal. So that even the threat of being held up before the International Criminal Court, we're thinking might be a really crucial deterrent and help change behavior.
Thank you. And Roberto, Pope Francis has a background as a scientist, and he's spoken about the urgency in addressing climate change. In the Laudato'Si, he discusses the climate crisis. He asks all of us to take swift action. Can you tell us about how global leaders have reacted to this and his urgent calls to action? And if you've seen any positive changes, and maybe discuss what are the greatest challenges in mobilizing world leaders to act on this really critical issue.
Thank you. All the work the Pope has been doing since 2015. We don't have to forget the Synod for the Amazonia in 2019 that was really, really important. In that Synod, Pope Francis promoted the introduction of ecocide in the Rome Statute when he said that ecocide should be recognized as the fifth category of crime against peace. As Kate said before, the Pope doesn't want to send people to hell nor to jail. So the meaning of this message is to change behaviors, to change the way people treat the world, the species, the biodiversity, and also the way we treat each other. Because as Pope Francis says in his encyclical, that is not a green message, it's not an ecological text in the traditional way. What he says, his message is very clear. There is no ecology without social justice. So I think this message was very powerful and has a very strong influence in the discussions that took place in 2015 and in the different meetings that came after this one. And also, I think it has a very strong influence in this summit that took place yesterday and today, called by President Biden.
Laudato'Si, we both work with organizations that focus on protecting the rights of indigenous peoples and their lands. As I mentioned before, 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is in indigenous and tribal lands, lands that they have sustainably managed for generations. This, of course, includes the Amazon, where climate change, fires, logging, agribusiness, and detrimental government policies have caused tremendous devastation for indigenous peoples. Can you discuss a little bit about the situation in the Amazon and what you see as the path forward?
Thank you, Daniel. It's great to be on this panel. And I'm just remembering Roberto's comment about the Amazon Synod. The Pope also traveled to the Amazon in 2018 and to Peruvian Amazon, where there's been incredible destruction, and really lent his voice there. It was a really important moment for the work we're doing in the forest. As you know, the Amazon, the largest tropical rainforest, is critical for planetary stability. It's like a vital organ. It's like the biological heart of a living Earth. And that, the Amazon rainforest is critical also for climate stability, meeting the Paris targets. If we lose the Amazon, there's no chance in meeting the Paris targets. So, and as you said, indigenous peoples at the core of protecting the Amazon. Something like 30 to 40% of the Amazon basin is indigenous lands. That's already recognized, and that areas are showing lower deforestation than areas that are even considered parks. So we know that indigenous peoples are key. The Biden administration, came into power in January, and even before, in the lead up to the election, he announced that he was committed to protecting the Amazon and addressing deforestation crisis. The 2019 fires really woke up humanity, and realizing that the Bolsonaro administration's policies are having a detrimental effect, actually increasing deforestation and putting more and more indigenous territories at risk. In fact, over 100 indigenous territories were being invaded during the 2019 fires, fueled in part by Bolsonaro's rhetoric. And so this influenced the elections, where President Biden made a pledge of protecting the Amazon and offered $20 billion towards initiatives to protect the rainforest. And of course, we want to see that happen. And we've been working with a coalition of organizations, including indigenous movement, social movements, to put human rights at the center of whatever Biden administration policy is going to be. We've been working on a platform called the Amazon Climate Platform, where you can go to Amazon Climate Platform and see the actions we're calling on the Biden administration to take early on in his administration to address deforestation, to address human rights violation, to address the COVID pandemic, and to address American corporate supply chains and investments that are fueling deforestation, and to do this in a way that is at a biome scale at the level of all 9 countries in the Amazon basin. And also, if the US administration which was rumored to have secret negotiations with Bolsonaro administration to reach a deal this week during the climate summit. We were very concerned about that. We felt that any deal that was reached in secret with the Bolsonaro administration was not going to be a good deal for the people of the Amazon or for the forests themselves. Of course, we are in favor of taking action for the Amazon, but we believe that human rights has to be at the center. Indigenous peoples have to be at the table. That corporate involvement, extractive industries and investments have to be included in any strategy to address deforestation, and that it cannot just be a secret deal with an administration that has no credibility, that has been actually rolling back indigenous rights, rolling back environmental protection, and fueling the rhetoric that's causing record levels of deforestation. So yeah, I will just say that we're hopeful that Biden administration will make a strong effort for the Amazon, but that effort be inclusive and put human rights at the center.
Evgeny, a great deal of your film focuses on the environmental devastation in numerous countries and the displaced people who are really climate refugees. How has the Pope addressed this issue of climate refugees? And how have audiences reacted to his thoughts and his actions on this issue of climate change?
I think from the beginning of the movie, Holy Father pointing that that's the most deep issue that he really pointing us human beings today, because that's what really we need to start to take care of. It's our common home. It's the home where we as big human family living. And I think for him, it's a really important element to bring to our attention that we need to stop destroy our home, because we are still one big family who living in this home. And if we want to continue being here in this planet and have our next future generation have a home to live, we need to truly start to care about this. And like he said during his trip in 2015, and Roberto mentioned this, his main part of his speech during the American Congress was pointing to the Laudato'Si, to his encyclical, where he pointing to all the issues that we as humanity facing. I think that's what we're trying to outline in the movie. That's how we starting the movie, with the scenery of what we surrounding ourselves. Sometimes humanity kind of closed between four walls, specifically last year, when we've been closed inside of pandemic kind of caves, we're forgetting that everything what we are surrounding ourselves, it's us. It's our disasters that we created. And the biggest disaster that affecting everything around us is the climate change. Climate change affecting the refugees, which starting to shift from one country to another because the drought, because of all other elements. And I think we need to start to really care about our common home. And I think everyone who watching the movie, he really facing this challenge to realize how tremendously distracted and damaged our planet. I think this scenery that I, as a filmmaker and storyteller, trying to bring from different parts of the world is sometimes so hard as the images to see for the people. But it's a true reality that we need to reevaluate, and we need to stop our sins, our crimes against humanity and against the nature. Because for me, like many people already said on this panel, Kate, Roberto, we are really creating these crimes against us, crimes against humanity, and in the same time, it's crimes against nature.
Thank you. This really brings up a question for me that I think a couple of you have touched on. And Roberto, you mentioned the idea or phrase that there's no ecology without social justice. And I know, Atosa, that you've called for climate justice in your work. And Kate, it ties into actually making ecocide a crime, which of course falls under this umbrella of justice. So it seems there's a number of sort of moving but very related ideas and parts here. So I'm wondering, maybe first, Atosa, you could speak to this concept of climate justice, and Kate and others can kind of also address this question of what justice really means in in a climate crisis? And how do we make sure that justice isn't kind of on the sideline of ideas, negotiations, plans, and proposals coming forward, but it's really at the center of how we move to address this really devastating time?
You know, I was on a panel the other day. One of my colleagues said this perfect metaphor, so I'm just going to borrow it and say, he said, if you're getting, if you're marginalized community or person of color or indigenous community that's being affected, and you're being thrown under the bus, you don't really care if the bus is electric or not. It doesn't really matter if it's an electric bus. So, giving that thought, the fact is that in the case of the Amazon basin, indigenous peoples are the guardians of the forest. They're truly the ones that are demonstrating through their practices, through their wisdom, and through their love, the fact that the forest is sacred to them, that the fact that they believe the forest is their mother, and that ultimately they see the Amazon as living forests, that for them, protecting the forest is just part of who they are. These are folks who are being, marginalized. There's an incredible amount of racism in Latin America. There's an incredible amount of discrimination. And they're also, putting their lives at the line. Every year, there are several hundred people, forest defenders, indigenous peoples, community leaders that are being killed, being, murdered, assassinated. Just in the last 3 months, there's been 3 people in the Peruvian Amazon that were murdered, indigenous leaders. These are people who are standing up to powerful interests. They're saying no to mining, no to oil companies, no to, hydroelectric dams. They're being displaced by these kinds of projects. And so what we're seeing, it's for a lot of these community leaders, is a dangerous game. And, protecting the forest, protecting our climate, we have to see these as stewards of Gaia, stewards of our living earth, stewards of life, instead of seeing, the way they're currently being treated, which is basically obstacle to so-called progress or obstacle to development. And that framework is coming from the industrial market economy, the neoliberal economic model it's life blind. Our economic system is life blind. And really, so if we're talking about climate justice, if we're talking about addressing climate change, we have to look at bringing people, putting people at the center, putting human rights at the center of climate policy. That means giving indigenous peoples a voice, and recognizing their rights and supporting their, their own solutions. And, so much of for example, the Biden administration, a lot of what we heard about the deal that was being in the works was to support this idea of, businesses and markets protecting the rainforest, creating financial incentives for markets to protect the rainforest. Yes, we want that, sure. Let's have protection of forests through financial incentives. But, let's not side skirt the fact that indigenous peoples and local environmental leaders are being shot and killed. Let's address that. Let's have there's a Escazú agreement, a new agreement by governments of Latin America that's just gone into effect, that among many things, it prioritizes transparency around environmental issues, and it prioritizes human rights. So I'll just stop there and say there's so much we can do, but giving voice and priority to human rights is a key part of having successful climate action.
I'd like to absolutely agree with everything Ecocide just said, really important points. And in particular, the importance of making sure important people's voices are heard. And I think the Stop Ecocide Foundation that have pulled together the panel that I'm working on now around the definition have done a really good job there in ensuring that the voices on the panel represent, the people who are really being affected by climate change and environmental disaster. Maybe to add a slightly different angle then, Daniel, on your question about justice, and to think about international criminal justice and what that adds and how that's important. I think there are 2 things that speak to the question as I heard you say it. One is the idea of international criminal justice is that justice is taken out of the hands of individual states, right? The birth of this, of course, is with the Second World War and the Holocaust, and the idea that just because things were legal in Nazi Germany does not mean that they're acceptable, and there are crimes that go beyond the power and the jurisdiction of an individual state because they harm all of us. So to elevate ecocide to the level of an international crime is to recognize that ecocide is a crime against all of us. And I think there's a justice there in that just because you happen to be living in a state which is not taking its responsibilities and protecting you, doesn't mean that the international community is giving up on you. You know, the international community is saying, actually, this is just not okay. And we're not going to leave it to domestic authorities to do whatever they like in this area. And I mean, you can see already in there the importance of having an inclusive voice in deciding what's pulled out, right? Because we can hear echoes in there of, you know, more problematic kind of colonial relationships. The other thing that I think is really important in making this a crime is that there are all sorts of really creative, brilliant legal actions going on around the world to defend the environment and victims of environmental actions, such as all the wonderful stuff about suing for the rights of future generations that we've seen, or looking at the rights of nature. All this stuff is great, it's brilliant, but civil actions require the plaintiffs to fund these lawsuits, right? And we know who, as Atossa just said, we know who the victims of this environmental destruction tend to be. They tend to be the most marginalized people with the fewest resources. And the burden is on them as victims to launch these kind of actions, right? Supported perhaps by civil society, etc. The thing about criminal law is it takes that responsibility away from the victims. And it says, you know, we as a community agree that these things can't happen. And a prosecution takes place, which is not reliant on the victims funding or launching the action themselves. So I think in both the idea of international criminal justice, which gives some sort of global justice, and the idea of criminal justice in itself, which takes a group responsibility for this rather than leaving it on the victims themselves to take action. I think both of those are ways in which we can see ecocide as introducing different justice mechanisms into this problem.
I do want to add something very important. And I had this conversation with Roberto when I was in Rome, and we all had it also with Pope Francis. I think everything should be starting with education. Specifically that Pope Francis in these days trying to point to the direction of younger generation that we're raising, because it starts all with education. If we will not educate the younger generation that grow, if we will not educate the people around us about the importance to change the minds and stop doing all the destructive things towards the climate change, I think we'll not get anywhere. Yes, we can throw the legal actions on right and left, but I think it all starts with education. And I think with the foundation, like Laudato'Si Foundation that Roberto is having, I think we're trying these days to implement more and more things into the education of the younger generation. Pope Francis personally trying to involve the younger generation into the different actions to fight for the climate change. And I think that's where we can start to put also a lot of emphasis, because I think it all starts with education. Any issue, we need not only to educate people, but also to give them a healthy and real possible solutions for our days, scientific solutions. And I think that's what we also need to see. I think, Roberto, you should join me in this situation, because that's the discussions that we had in Rome. And I think that's what also close to Holy Father's heart, because this fall, I think in Italy, they do planning to have a youth summit on the climate change, specifically young people from all over the world for whom this issue is really important, who can spread this word and also fight for this cause and bring awareness through their actions. I think everything starts with education.
Yes, as you said, Evgeny, the important thing is prevention, education. We have to think in the future, we have to think in future generations, but unfortunately, we are seeing and suffering now the consequences of climate change. So we don't have more time, we have to act now. And the most important thing regarding the conception of an integral ecology that Pope Francis presented in his encyclical is the idea that we have to take into consideration in the center of our planet, in the center of the creation, the human being. So we cannot think or discuss what to do with our environmental crisis without participation of those who are systematically and usually marginalized, discriminated, like poor people, refugees, that are the persons who suffer more the impact of climate change. And as Pope Francis said yesterday in his Earth Day message, we don't have more time. We have to change now. We have to act now. Let's hear what Pope Francis said yesterday in his message.
Hermanos y hermanas, en esta conmemoración del Día de la Tierra, siempre es bueno recordar cosas que nos decimos mutuamente para que no caigan en el olvido. Desde hace tiempo estamos tomando más conciencia de que la naturaleza merece ser protegida. Aunque sea por el hecho de que las interacciones humanas con la biodiversidad de Dios deben hacerse con el máximo cuidado y con respeto. Cuidar la biodiversidad, cuidar la naturaleza. Y esto en esta pandemia lo hemos aprendido mucho más. También esta pandemia nos ha demostrado qué ocurre cuando el mundo se para, hace una pausa, aunque sea de unos pocos meses, y el impacto que esto tiene en la naturaleza y el cambio climático de una manera tristemente positiva, ¿no? Es decir, hace daño. Y esto nos demuestra que la naturaleza global necesita de nuestras vidas en este planeta. A todos nos afecta, aunque de múltiples formas diversas e inequívocas. Y es así que también nos enseña más sobre lo que necesitamos hacer para crear un planeta justo, equitativo, ambientalmente seguro. En resumen, la pandemia del COVID nos ha enseñado esta interdependencia, compartir el planeta. Y ambas catástrofes globales, COVID y el clima, demuestran que no tenemos tiempo para esperar. El tiempo nos apremia. Y que, como lo ha demostrado la COVID-19, sí tenemos los medios para enfrentar el desafío. Tenemos los medios. Es el momento de actuar. Estamos en el límite. Quisiera repetir un dicho viejo español. Dios perdona siempre. Los hombres perdonamos de vez en cuando. La naturaleza no perdona más. Y cuando se gatilla esta destrucción de la naturaleza, es muy difícil frenarla, pero todavía estamos a tiempo. Y vamos a ser más resilientes cuando trabajemos juntos, en lugar de hacerlo solo. La adversidad que estamos viviendo con la pandemia y que ya en el cambio climático la sentimos, nos va a impulsar, nos tiene que impulsar a la innovación, a la invención, a buscar caminos nuevos. De una crisis no se sale igual, salimos mejores o peores. Este es el desafío. Y si no salimos mejores, vamos por un camino de autodestrucción. Que todos ustedes, y yo también me uno a ustedes, a un llamado a todos los líderes del mundo, para que actúen con valentía, que actúen con justicia, y que siempre digan la verdad a la gente, para que la gente sepa cómo protegerse de la destrucción del planeta, cómo proteger al planeta de la destrucción que muchas veces nosotros gatillamos. Gracias por lo que hacen, gracias por la buena intención, gracias por reunirse todos y prosperidad para todos.
Well, with the time that we have left, I'd like to ask everyone to discuss specific calls to action that viewers can take. From our end at Survival International, we're working, as I mentioned, to assist Indigenous peoples that are protecting their lands from invasion and destruction. And as Atosa said about Indigenous territories in the Amazon, for example, are being better barriers to deforestation than even protected areas. We just have more and more evidence emerging that the best way to protect ecosystems like the Amazon is to defend the land rights of Indigenous and tribal peoples. And we believe a mass movement of the public is really one critical component to real change. And so on our website, we have many, many actions about just that, of getting people involved. And I'll highlight just one here. In Brazil, which is home to the most uncontacted tribes in the world, President Jair Bolsonaro, he's trying to turn back the clock on Indigenous rights. His government's trying to strip them of their autonomy, sell off their territories, open it up for logging and mining, and assimilate them against their wishes. But Indigenous peoples are fighting back, and people can visit our webpage and our Stop Brazil's Genocides campaign page there for more information on how to get involved, to support Indigenous struggles, which of course are not critical just for them and their futures, but for the future of the entire planet. Atosa, you talked a little bit about what you were asking of the Biden administration and climate action commitments. Can you talk more about the calls to action that you have?
Sure, Daniel, I would just echo the sentiment that we have an urgent crisis in the Amazon. The Amazon basin is reaching a tipping point of no return where the hydrological cycle begins to unravel. We have a very short period of time. We're calling for protection of the Amazon and restoration of the Amazon. I believe that there are many short-term things that we have to do. There are some longer terms we have to do. So on the short term, we have to address the deforestation crisis. We have to get to zero deforestation now. We have to hold accountable supply chains and companies that are buying or financing products that are driving deforestation. We have to reduce the consumption of deforestation products into markets like cattle, for example, and soy and gold, illegal gold that's coming into market. So there's much we can do. AmazonWatch.org has a lot of action alerts and reports that people can learn more about. That's in the short term. The AmazonClimatePlatform.org is another organization where you can look specifically what we're calling on the Biden administration to do and be part of a movement that's pushing the Biden administration to take climate action in a way that is supporting human rights and Indigenous rights. And then long term, I want to just say that I totally agree education is a key point, changing our mindset, seeing who we are as human beings in a web of life, in putting the primacy of the web of life, life flourishing, and that includes people flourishing as a center of our planetary quest for planetary health. That means we have to change the financial and economic systems, the monetary system. We have to promote debt cancellation and around the world for countries that are struggling to decide between drilling more oil to pay off the debt, their national debt. We have to fight for debt relief. We have to push for economic self-reliance and mutual aid and universal basic income. Really, we have to change our economic system logic, and those are longer term work. And that's the work I'm doing with the Sacred Headwaters Initiative. People can go to sacredheadwaters.org to learn more about that long-term, changing the rules, changing the mindset, changing the paradigm. And lastly, I'll mention for the faith community, which is a big part of this audience that's going to watch this film, there is the interfaithrainforest.org, Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, that is pulling together religious and interfaith religious leaders from all around the world to protect rainforests all around the world. And that's an important place that people in the faith community can plug in and be more active. So I really appreciate this time. Thank you for having me.
Great, thank you, Atosa. And Kate, you're asking for people to sign the Stop Ecocide petition. What does this petition demand, and who or what entity will it be delivered to?
So the Stop Ecocide petition, please do look at the Stop Ecocide website. It's a really important symbol of the groundswell of support for the ecocide movement. And I would say that right now we're really at some kind of interesting tipping point for the ecocide idea. I mean, it's just landing in a way. I haven't seen before. And states are coming on board. I think 10 or 11 states that are members of the Rome Statute system, members of the International Criminal Court, have publicly said that they're interested in seeing what our definition is. I'm personally being asked to speak to students and journalists. We're seeing more and more articles being published. And I would say become part of that snowball. So whatever you're doing, I mean, if you're a journalist, please write about ecocide. If you're a teacher, please teach about it. If you're a student, please learn about it. I really feel that this is a moment that we need to seize. The fact that Pope Francis has given his support in December 2019 to this idea is incredibly powerful. We are in a moment. Add your voice, educate yourself, speak to your politicians and your representatives. And I feel like we actually have a chance to make something happen in this area.
Great, thank you, Kate. And Roberto and Evgeny, what are your hopes with the Laudato'Si and its exposure that it's getting with the film and will get?
Well, we have a lot to do. We have to arrive to a strong compromise of states to reduce and to eliminate emissions. That's the main goal, I think, for everyone. And we have to rethink all the international financial system too. And particularly, we have to put some light on the situation of middle income countries that concentrate more of 60% of poverty of the world. So they are not considered as poor countries, but they have more of the half of poverty of the world. And of course, we have to change. And we, as I said before, we have to change through education. We have to change through law. We have to use all the tools we have in order to build together a better future and to protect our common home.
I guess it comes back to me. What we are doing, the movie is an educational tool, which with the help of Discovery, with the help of my impact team, with the help of Roberto and Laudato'Si Foundation, we're trying to bring more attention to the subject matters and to the topics are in the movie, to educate people. Same time, we are launched right now the educational programs based on the movie. And as essential part of these programs are climate change. And not only climate change as what it is right now, also the possible solutions that, for example, if you're talking about curriculum for the schools, for the kids in the earlier grades, what they can do at their own homes as a solution when they come in from school home, how they can separate, for example, trash and do recycling stuff that already helps to treat certain elements that related to climate change. So we're trying to start educate next generation and the people of today's world what can be the solutions that we can implement today to reverse the climate back. And I think that's the important thing that we all share here, because without that, we can fight, but without education, we're not able to prevent this genocide, this climate genocide to be continued. So I think with the help of the foundation, with the help of my impact team, with the help of Discovery, we're working right now on educational programs, also for the schools, also for the colleges, and also for the universities, where the future leaders can learn how scientifically they can help to reverse the climate change back. And of course, all the legal initiatives can be a part of these programs as a part of the educational things. And of course, events that can bring more attention to the fight for the climate change. I currently involved with the Roberto and with the foundation on setting many events around action, around calls for action, to bring more attention, not only to the movie, but what we depicting in the movie. So I think actions, the events, education through the school, colleges, and universities, that's how I see ability to reverse the climate change.
Thank you so much to all of the panelists here for this conversation and all their important work on climate change and how we can address it in ways that put marginalized people first. I think there's a lot of hope in this conversation, and a lot of ways that we can move forward, and I hope we move forward together. And I just really hope also that this conversation spurs others who are watching to get involved and support these and other efforts all around the globe that deal with climate change. So thanks to you all, and please be well.